Hi, everyone. Welcome to History 1302. This is lecture one in the semester. This is the rhyming nature of history. And the reason I say the rhyming nature of history is I'm sure that many of you have heard the phrase history repeats itself, that history has a funny way of history or of repeating itself, or some form about how those who are who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it, all that sort of nonsense. Well, history doesn't repeat itself. History is always a little bit different. There are lessons that wind up being handed down by historians that they talk about how a similar circumstance happened during this particular era. And we always mention these sorts of things. And repetition is sort of an easy word for it. It suggests that there's something that's just kind of cyclical and it happens without human interactions. The reason I say that's too simple is because there's always human interactions. The way we react to things, the impetus that causes us to make changes, these are all always different. So history never repeats itself. But in a discussion with another student a few years ago, I actually wound up. They actually came up with this really great idea, and I freely admit I'm stealing it from this student. They talked about how history rhymes, and I think that's a very good way of putting it, that there are circumstances that we see where we can say that happened before and we know what we did here, so it's not going to work, or why don't we try this time, or whatever. So history rhymes. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that the period in which this class begins, the 1870s, is one of those periods where we can see a rhyming nature of history, not parallels, not repetition, but a sort of rhyming nature, if you will. So we'll get started here. And the first of our five parallels, or our five rhymes during this period, is a plague of drugs in the United States. Now, America's first drug crisis did not actually happen during the 1930s through the 50s with the era of quote unquote reefer madness. Wasn't the counterculture of the 1960s or the cocaine craze of the 1980s. The problem of our plague of drugs, our first real plague of drugs, happened during the 1870s and 1880s. And for a very simple reason, an easy one to detect, there were thousands of Civil War veterans who had come home, who had had various disabilities, permanent disabilities, and they were addicted to all sorts of drugs, primarily morphine, for a number of those reasons. Additionally, cocaine actually came into vogue not in the 1980s, but in the 1870s in a variety of forms. There were cocaine cigarettes that were available, cigars, inhalants. Cocaine was so widely available that it was actually sold in apothecaries. It was openly sold in the United States, and the use of it was widespread. Opium was even more widely available than things like cocaine, and used more widely than at any other point in America's history. It was even used in a form that was developed to calm babies down who had various problems. So all of this drug use was coming about during the 1870s. And it was a very long time for a lot of Americans to see the problem with drug use, or to see any problems associated with drug use. And again, this is why I say it's a rhyme, not a similarity or not a repetition, because during this particular era, the way people looked at drug use was that for the most part, drug use was generally positive. It relieved maladies. It helped these Civil War veterans get through their days. Eugene O'Neill wrote a play about his own mother's cocaine addiction. So this first plague of drugs in the United States had a distinct characteristic to it. Zero side effects was what most people thought about drug use, and that there were many positive benefits to the use of drugs in this country. Again, the exact opposite is the idea that prevails today. Now, parallel number two, or rhyme number two, is a purity crusade in the United States. In the 1870s, Kansas began passing laws that gave statutory force to the 10 Commandments. Now, what I want you to understand about this is I'm not telling you that people took the 10 Commandments more seriously, or that there was something wrong with the idea of hearing the Ten Commandments or anything like that. Even though we in the United States often talk about our laws being based on Judeo-Christian principles, we do not typically give statutory force to the Ten Commandments, i.e., if you violate this one of the Ten Commandments, you can be arrested. That doesn't exist for the most part in American history. But in the 1870s, Kansas does precisely that. They give statutory force to the Ten Commandments. The New Hampshire Senate proposed a constitutional amendment, an amendment to their own state constitution that would have established that New Hampshire and the rest of the United States had been created under Christian principles, and thus they could enforce Christian tenets as the law of the state of New Hampshire. This would have been problematic for anybody who happened to not be a Christian in the state of New Hampshire. Massachusetts began passing a series of laws that were referred to as quote unquote blue laws, which other states soon adopted. A lot of states didn't get rid of these so-called blue laws until the 1980s. Texas in particular didn't get rid of its blue laws until the 1980s. And what these blue laws were, these were laws that made it essentially illegal to conduct virtually every form of business on a Sunday in accordance with keeping the Sabbath sacred. For example, New York State made it illegal to get haircuts on Sundays. Part of those blue laws, again, virtually every state banned lotteries in their state. Many states banned horse racing as part of these blue laws. So there was a real challenge to the idea of moral purity, or an emphasis toward moral purity, just like we're kind of seeing in the modern era. In Tennessee, for what it's worth, during this era, they banned the sale and manufacture of cigarettes during this era, a law that was actually upheld by the state Supreme Court. But by far, the biggest effort toward moral purity and the biggest moral crusade in the United States during this era was a crusade against alcohol consumption. Critics in the United States, just like they did in the 1830s and 1840s, looked at alcohol as the problem behind every issue in the United States, from crime to poverty to domestic abuse, wife beating, all of these things. If you peeled back the layers, you'd find alcohol consumption. Now, the group that's leading the way in this particular era is a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That's a mouthful to say. The Women's Christian Temperance Union. And their goals were very simple. They were absolutely prohibitionist from the standpoint of a voluntary agreement. Their goals were very simple. Get people to sign a pledge, much like the card that you see on the screen, a pledge that a person would agree to give up alcohol consumption. They would not drink alcohol. Now, these promises were all well and good, but ultimately, the Women's Christian Temperance Union wound up moving toward actual prohibition, getting laws and limits placed on the sale and manufacture of alcohol. So simply having individuals agree to do all of this stuff was not enough. There wound up being a movement toward prohibition. Now, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other groups like them believed that immigrants in the United States drank the most. So as a consequence, they also consciously sought limits on immigration to the United States as well. Now, there's also, during this particular era, a movement towards sexual prudery in the United States. Congress passed a series of laws that were collectively known as the Comstock Act. The actual piece of legislation was called the Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles for Immoral Use, but we're going to call it the Comstock Act, because one of the key lobbyists for this act was a YMCA official from Massachusetts named Anthony Comstock. Now, this act, the Comstock Act, prohibited the shipment via the mail of anything that was quote unquote deemed offensive. Now, there's the really tough part of this. Deemed offensive. Well, who deems stuff offensive? Well, in the early stages of enforcement, it's going to be Anthony Comstock. Congress had no idea about what to do with this. And in any event, Congress is not in charge of enforcement of laws. They passed the law, and the executive branch wound up putting Anthony Comstock in charge of executing these laws. So Comstock essentially had a free hand to get rid of all sorts of things, and he enforced this in a very zealous manner. More than 500,000 pieces of artwork were destroyed at a Boston Museum of Art. He had fig leaves painted over genitals of nude portraits. He had a lot of sculptures destroyed during this era. He also had a lot of books and pamphlets that were banned. You can see two titles on the screen that were actually banned, Fanny Hill and the Lustful Turk. But the biggest effect that this actually had was on birth control. And this is going to be something that does not change until the 1960s. Comstock took a very broad interpretation of what offensive actually was. And his position was that since the Bible said that mankind was to be fruitful and multiply, that was the command that God gave human beings. Since the Bible said that, anything that sought to limit births was an affront to God. It was offensive. So Comstock believed that any sort of pamphlet that described birth control, anything that would limit births, was offensive. Now, this position on birth control stuck in the United States. The Supreme Court did not overturn Comstock's interpretation of this sort of stuff until 1963. So a lot of times when we see these sorts of laws, when we see these things happening during these eras, they do wind up having these really long-term effects. It's not something that just happens in the moment and it affects people in the moment. There are much longer-term consequences to this stuff. Now, our next area of parallel or rhyme is government retrenchment. Now, again, this is a rhyme. Remember, it's not literally the exact same sort of thing that's happening each time in each era. What we're seeing in the moment is a push toward government retrenchment, just like we see in the modern United States. You'll hear a lot of congressmen and a lot of people in government talking about the absolute necessity of cutting spending and cutting the size of government and getting rid of unnecessary government spending. Both parties talk about it at various points. But in the 1870s, these people were absolutely dead set on government retrenchment. They were not going to spend money unless they absolutely had to. For example, the federal government at one point in the 1870s cut the salary of every single federal employee up to 50% in some cases. Now, the goal was not to bring wages down or anything like that. The goal was to convince people that working for the federal government was not a suitable idea for a profession. Get out of working for the federal government. So they cut the salaries. In Texas, in the state of Texas, in order to encourage the legislature to get their jobs done and get in and out without passing a bunch of laws that would affect the day-to-day lives of Texans, Texas paid state legislatures $2 a day if they met for more than 60 days, but they paid them $5 a day if they met for less than 60 days. The message was clear: get into session and get out of session as quickly as possible. Now, when I say that these people were saying we're not going to spend money unless we absolutely have to, listen to what the governor of Virginia declared about public education. He said that, quote, education should be paid for by those who use it. Okay. Now, his point in all of this was, is if you don't have children who are going to public schools, there's no reason why you should pay, your taxes should go to pay for public schools. If you don't want your taxes, forget if you don't have kids doing this. If you don't like the very idea of public schools and you don't want your taxes going to it, well, the governor of Virginia said you shouldn't have to do this sort of thing. Your taxes shouldn't go to pay for it. This is a really odd proposition coming out of Virginia, because some of you may or may not be aware of this. The person who was kind of credited with the very basic idea of a public education necessity in this country was from Virginia as well. His name was Thomas Jefferson. You've probably heard of him. But by this point, the governor of Virginia is saying, we don't want it. Now, not to pick on Southern schools, but the Southern schools were very aggressive in cutting public school funding during this particular era. In the 1870s and 1880s, most Southern children attended school for less than 100 school days per year. Less than 100 days per year, there was attendance at schools. They cut the school year by 20% on average across the entirety of the South. But again, this is not about picking on the South. Everybody is seeing this problem. Across the country, okay, schools were spending an average of $6 per person per year, $6 per child per year. So when it came to public spending that was directed toward education, there was a real attack on that sort of stuff. There was a real thought that, we should not be spending anything unless we absolutely have to. Now, it's almost a circumstance of Murphy's Law that if you are going to see this type of retrenchment, if you're going to see governments cutting back, then you're also going to see along with it a massive increase in the amount of corruption. And during this particular era, there is an enormous amount of corruption at the state level in particular, in all of these states where we see budgets being cut and budgets being slashed. I've got a bunch of numbers on the screen, and I'm going to run through them really quickly, but I want you to see them to get an overall picture of how much money is being lost during this era. These are not adjusted for inflation. These are contemporaneous dollar figures, okay? So we're not adjusting them out and saying this is 400,000, for example, in Tennessee. This is $400,000 in 2022 money. This is $400,000 in 1875 money. Okay, so you can take that number and it'll explode if you actually adjust it for inflation and cost of living. But I'm not going to test you on the exact numbers. What I want you to see is how much money is being lost here. The state treasurer of Tennessee stole $400,000 from the state over the course of his term. In Arkansas, the state treasurer stole a total of $215,000. In Kentucky, it was $229,000. In Mississippi, it was $316,000. And Louisiana was the king of all of these. The state treasurer in Louisiana took off with approximately $777,000 in bearer bonds that if he had hit the marketplace at the right time, they could have been worth about $750,000, or they could have gone up to as much as $1.5 million because of the state of the marketplace. Either way, an enormous amount of money taken away from the state treasury. Now, the other place we can see something really bad is if we look at the state of Mississippi. In one particular year, this was 1874, I believe, the entire state expenditure, their budget, was less than $100,000. And in that individual year alone, the state education secretary stole $40,000. So there's just an incredible amount of corruption at the governmental level here. Now, building projects are always a good source of that. What we saw on the last screen was that was just plain old theft. That was people literally just taking money, stealing that money. But where we typically see theft, where we think of the worst graft, if you will, in government, is in building projects. That's what a lot of government officials and commentators frequently refer to as quote unquote honest graft, because it's not literally just reaching in and stealing money. It's padding expenses. It's taking projects and producing kickbacks or no bid contracts and things like that. To give you an example, if we look at the Iowa State Capitol building, that's the building that's pictured on the top of these two pictures on the screen here. The Iowa State Capitol was built literally costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to the taxpayers of Iowa. And the foundation began to collapse within a decade because of the poor engineering and the lack of structure. It's worth pointing out here, I'm going to bring the cursor in so that you can kind of see this. But if you look at these domes that are here, you'll notice that the one that's right in the center is a little bit different than the other domes. That one was that dome was overlaid in solid gold. So the money went into stuff like that as opposed to structural engineering and foundation. My personal favorite during all of this stuff was the Tweed Courthouse in New York City. Now, this was built right around the same time as Big Ben, the famous clock tower in London in the 1870s. Big Ben cost about $3 million for the English to build that structure. The New York spent $10 million in constructing the Tweed Courthouse, which is pictured on the bottom of the screen. It began in the 1870s. It included a table and a set of chairs. The table and the 6 chairs that accompanied it cost more than $100,000. There was one plasterer who built the state of New York, and they paid him. He billed the state $137,000 for 2 days worth of work in the 1870s. Now, I don't know any of you. I don't know what your experiences are. I don't know if any of you have connections to building trades or anything like that, but you could do a ton of plastering today for $137,000. So it's just a massive amount of graft that's going on here. Why the Tweed Courthouse is my favorite of these types of projects. If you see it there at the bottom of the screen, it looks pretty nice, but it has been under a constant state of construction since the 1870s. It's never been quote unquote finished, if you will. Now, our next area of rhyme, our next parallel of sorts, is a retreat from civil rights. Beginning in the 1870s, despite what was talked about during Reconstruction, if you had me in 1301, or if your professor got to the Reconstruction era in 1301, there was a push towards civil rights in the United States. And one of the bits that came out of the Reconstruction era was that, on paper at least, the freedmen, the former slaves, had civil rights in the United States on paper. But there was a constant push to erode those civil rights beginning in the 1870s. We see a series of devices, legal or otherwise. We're going to refer to those as extra legal in a second. And what they're being done, what the reason they're existing is to stop African Americans from voting. Now, these same techniques, it's worth pointing out here, excuse me, were also often employed against poor whites in the North. And I'm going to say that you are going to need to know these things for your first exam. Now, these first things that we're going to be talking about are what we're going to call legal measures, meaning that there are laws on the books that deal with the precise topics that we're going to talk about. Okay, so there's something that says that, you can first, for the first bullet point, you can engage in voter registration. We're going to register all of the people who live in an area to vote. We're going to require them to come in and register so that they can vote. Voter registration is new. It did not exist until the 1870s. And the idea behind voter registration is to get people to come in, identify themselves for government officials, and sign on a line that says that they will do certain things. There were a lot of former slaves, and it's also worth pointing out here, there's a lot of poor whites across the South who don't have a particularly good image of the government for reasons that are related to education, for reasons that are related to the Civil War, and their just general distrust of the United States government. So voter registration consciously held down the total voting numbers. But it's also worth pointing out here that there's no question that it was designed to stop African Americans from voting as opposed to white voters. There was a second legal measure that we're going to talk about here, a requirement that a voter registration card be presented in order to vote. There was also a requirement that would ban all criminals from voting. This is put right into the laws of these various states and localities. Now, barring of all criminals from voting, including those who are convicted of misdemeanors, if we were in here in an in-person class, I'd be asking you all to look at what I'm talking about on the screen and tell me if any of these things say one word about race. And of course, you would answer no, that none of these things say a single word about race. So why am I asking you about race here? Well, if we add that, what we've just talked about, to the change that happens to something called a switch to the ballot that's called the Australian ballot, where you cannot put party symbols on a ballot, and people are going to have to rely on their literacy in order to vote. What these are going to do is these are going to affect African Americans disproportionately. We don't see any word in any of these statutes about race, any of the laws that, for example, say that people are going to have to come and register to vote. You're going to have to present ID and vote. But the fact of the matter is, most people, most freedmen didn't have identification. Most freedmen wouldn't have had any idea where a voter registration card would have been. Most freedmen were subject to incredibly stern law enforcement, to the point that, for example, in a lot of southern cities, it was illegal for an African American male to walk along the same sidewalk as an Anglo female. If he didn't step off of the sidewalk and allow her to walk past, he was in violation of the law. So a lot of African Americans wound up going to jail and being convicted on very minor crimes, which would subsequently stop them from being able to vote. And then we also have the institution of time limits being thrown into all of this. These were, again, legal measures that are employed to bring down the black vote. Now, this doesn't make them right. I'm not talking about any sort of moral structure or anything like that. I'm not telling you that these measures are good or bad or right or anything. What I'm telling you is that they are protected by legal statute. Now, those who sought to deprive African Americans of the right to vote also employed what are called extra legal measures. Now, I want to make a quick detour here and say that extra legal does not mean illegal. Okay. Extra legal simply means that this is something that's happening outside of the legal structure. If something were illegal, okay, it would be prohibited by law. Okay. So we're not talking about things that are illegal. We're talking about things that are happening outside of the legal structure in the United States. So, for example, things like the use of false bottom ballot boxes. That would be one way. You see certain voters coming up, you pull a tray out so that their ballot goes to the bottom of the box, you slide the tray back in, and now you start collecting other ballots. There are really easy ways to create false bottom ballot boxes, though what I just described is probably the easiest one. Another extra legal measure to decrease black voting was to move the polling location without notice, or tamper with voter registration rolls, where registrars would simply say, either we're not going to allow you to register, or they would simply tell people that, well, I'm looking at the registration roll here and I don't see your name on it. Okay. And then also there's, it's just kind of a truism, something that we'll talk about more in lecture 2, is that when all of these other things don't work, violence absolutely would work. To give you an idea of how effective these sorts of things were, in one election in Louisiana, 40 African Americans were killed. That was the 1894 election. These people were killed simply for attempting to vote in the state of Louisiana. Now, our fifth parallel, or our fifth rhyme, if you will, is a disputed presidential election. The election of 1876. If you were in 1301 with me, we closed on the election of 1876. So you might want to, you can use this to kind of stretch or whatever. Or if you don't remember it, you can kind of refresh your memory here too. But the election of 1876 was a disputed presidential election. We have plenty of recent memory and recent exposure to disputed presidential elections. But this particular election very nearly set off a civil war. And I don't mean in the ways that we've talked about or we've seen civil, attempts at a civil war in our era. We're talking about these people literally 12 years out from the Civil War, believed that there was a very good chance that the Civil War was going to start again. Now, the election of 1876 involved the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the governor of Ohio, fighting it out with Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York. And when this election happened, I've got the numbers up here. I'm never, ever going to test you on election numbers. I just want you to see the numbers so that you can see what I'm talking about here. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote easily, and he won the electoral vote relatively easily enough. The problem here is this. There is no provision in the Constitution if one candidate says, well, I just don't accept the electoral results. Okay. Now, we should all be well aware that the electoral votes are the ones that matter. The electoral votes are just kind of quote, awarded, if you will, on election night. They're not actually counted and tabulated until December following the election. And then those election results, those tabulations, are not actually certified until the following January. So there's a lot of things that can happen in between those periods here. And what we see in the election of 1876 is that the Republican candidate and the Republican Party under Rutherford B. Hayes, the guy at the bottom, says that we don't accept the results of the election. And they argue that there was widespread electoral fraud and that they are legally challenging the results in South Carolina, Louisiana, Oregon, and Florida. Now, they had evidence and they presented this evidence, and this evidence didn't get tossed out of court, like that. The problem was, again, there's no provision in the Constitution for what do we do now. There's provision if somebody doesn't win a majority in the Electoral College. There's a provision if the vote is actually too close to call, then the election winds up going in the presidential election goes to the House of Representatives, vice presidential election goes to the Senate. That's all laid out in the Constitution. But what do we do if one side says, no, I don't agree with the results? So ultimately, Congress got together and said, well, since the framers of the Constitution said that Congress will decide if nobody wins a majority, it seems rational to us that Congress would be the ones who would decide in any sort of electoral controversy. So what Congress decided to do was create a committee. They were going to pull 5 people from the House of Representatives, 5 people from the United States Senate, and 5 people from the United States Supreme Court. And to make sure that there was no chance that this would all fall along party lines, the two parties got together. They chose 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and it just so happened that there was an independent on the Supreme Court. So among those 5 Supreme Court justices that were chosen, one of them was the independent, to make sure that it's 7-7-1. So there will definitely not be a party line vote here. However, the Democrats decided that they were going to try to get a leg up on all of this stuff. The Democrats offered this justice, the Supreme Court justice, the senatorship from his home state of Illinois. They said, we want you to become the new senator from the state of Illinois. And he wanted this. He loved this idea. So he took the job. But he then turned around and had an attack of conscience and said, well, I've taken the job, but because I've taken that job, I cannot be on this electoral committee anymore. So he resigned. And since his seat was one of the seats from the Supreme Court, he had to be replaced by a Supreme Court justice. And there were no other people on the Supreme Court but Republicans. So wound up on this electoral committee being actually an 8-7 split. In the end, it was an 8-7 Republican to Democrat split. And to virtually no one's surprise, when they looked over the evidence and voted on what to do about South Carolina, Louisiana, Oregon, and Florida, they voted 8-7 to give all of those votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. So they took all of the votes from the Tilden column, moved them over to the Hayes column, and now Hayes had the necessary electoral votes to win. Now, Samuel Tilden was furious about this. The Democrats were furious about this. They believed they called shenanigans on this. And to be fair, I'll just kind of lay this out there. If there had been 8 Democrats, if it had been 8-7 on the Democratic Party's side, I'm sure the Democrats would have done the exact same thing. They would have certified the election and said, no, Tilden won. So clearly this was political partisanship, and everybody is flipping out all of a sudden. The states are starting to see the rhetoric heat up again. The Democrats and the Republicans are arguing with one another. The states of Virginia and Massachusetts actually mobilized their militias, thinking, well, it's time for the Civil War to start up again. We better be ready this time. So everybody is in a state of crisis. But the leadership of the two parties, this is again why I say this stuff rhymes, but it's not a repetition. In January of 1877, the two parties actually kind of had some common sense. The leadership of the two parties got together and said, we cannot let this happen. This is threatening to destroy the country. We better find some common ground right now and resolve this so that a war does not actually begin. And what they wind up doing in January of 1877, they meet in the proverbial smoke-filled room of a hotel in Washington, D.C., and they hammer out what came to be known, excuse me, as the Compromise of 1877. Now, as part of that Compromise of 1877, the Democrats and the Republicans are both going to agree that Rutherford B. Hayes has won the presidency. They will certify the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. However, if Rutherford B. Hayes wants to be the president, he is going to have to appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. Now, for those of you who are thinking, why appoint a Democrat? It's really very simple. The Democrats want to keep an eye on what the Republicans are doing. What better way to do it than have one of their own on his cabinet? Hayes must support federal aid for railroad reconstruction in the South. For those of you who have taken 1301 already, you should remember that the Union forces, when they came through the South, just destroyed railroads and they tore things up in an unbelievable fashion. They wanted their infrastructure back in the South, so they wanted the federal government to pay for it. So they said, if you want the presidency, part of the cost is you've got to rebuild our railroads. And Hayes and the Republicans agree. And then finally, this is kind of the end point of Reconstruction. All of the federal troops who had been sent to the South in the Reconstruction era, these were people who were protecting the rights of the former slaves. They were enforcing the military sanctions and the military districts that had been laid out in the post-Civil War era. All of those federal troops were to be removed immediately. Now, this makes the Compromise of 1877 a very important, crucial moment for the United States. The historical significance of the Compromise of 1877 is that the parties essentially agreed that the South was going to handle its own racial problems without interference from the federal government. I mean, after all, that's what the federal troops were there to do in the first place. They were there initially to make sure that the Union Army didn't leave and it returned to business as usual in the South. Now, the thought was that, well, it's been 12 years of relative, quote unquote, peace. So we don't think slavery's coming back, so we can withdraw these troops. So Southerners are going to handle their own racial affairs without interference. And the North is going to basically wind up dominating the nation's economy. The South is literally going to the federal government and saying, yes, we want you to engage in infrastructure development here. We want this infrastructure development, and we want the federal government to pay for it with the railroads. So they're giving, on some level, control over the nation's economy to the northern parties, the northern section of this country. What this does is it creates a massive political coalition between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans that really doesn't go away until the 1980s. In the 1980s, following the 1980 election, President Ronald Reagan very briefly held a Republican majority in the Senate, never had a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. But it didn't matter. He got most of his agenda passed because he could count on Southern Democrats voting almost in a block with Northern Republicans who absolutely supported what Ronald Reagan did. So he got his agenda passed because, again, of this thing that happens in the 1870s, but has these long-standing consequences for the United States. Now, what's the impact of this coalition? How does this actually affect the United States? Well, we've got to look at what the South was like in the 1870s and 1880s to understand how important this was. The South, according to one contemporary writer, was, quote, crushed, wretched, and licking its wounds. There were the problems of trying to, quote unquote, rebuild from the Civil War, the literal reconstruction of the post-Civil War era. But there were also massive public health crises. There was a yellow fever epidemic that hit the South, killing thousands of people. It killed 1,100 people in Vicksburg, Tennessee, almost 4,000 people in New Orleans. There were massive infrastructure and economic problems, though, as well. Railroads across the South traveled at maximum speeds of 10 to 15 miles per hour. And then from an economic development standpoint, compared to the North, by the way, northern owned railroads traveled at 5 to 6 times that speed. The average income of Southerners, to give you an idea of what type of economic development was lacking across the South, the average income of a Southerner was only 27% of that of a Northerner. Now, if we took that to contemporary standards today, think about the difference in the type of living that a person would have if they made $100,000 a year versus somebody who made $27,000 a year. Okay, so those are some basics about what's going on in the American South. And just like people in the 1960s looked at what the so-called third world was and said, this is a place where we can make a lot of money and make it very quickly, people looked at the South in the exact same way in the 1870s and 1880s. They literally looked at it as a place to get rich quick. Person wrote a book with the actual title, How to Get Rich Quick in the South. And it was a very simple method to do that. Northerners very quickly realized that what the South lacked in economic development, what they might lack in terms of infrastructure, they had in resources in incredible amounts. One big time resource that the South had was land. In 1876, one northern congressman, put together a consortium and bought 186,000 acres in Louisiana. By the end of the 1870s, a consortium or a corporation comprised of 41 Northerners owned 1.37 million acres in the state of Louisiana. Now, making all of that, and they'd purchased this land. They were going in and buying up land from desperate farmers in these areas. However, states like Texas, for example, were literally giving land away. Now, understand this is the high point of an era that was referred to as, quote, the laissez-faire era, that the government keeps its hands out of the day-to-day affairs of people and keeps their hands out of business by design. But look at what they do in the state of Texas to create development in the state. Texas gave away 32 million acres of land by having railroad companies come to them and say, we want to build railroads through Texas. And Texans were going, that's great, we want railroads. And these railroad companies said, well, we really don't want to pay a lot for this land. And Texas, the state government said, you buy the land that it requires to build the railroad, and we'll give you 8 miles in either direction of that land. So railroad companies are coming in, they're buying a little bit of land, they're getting a massive amount of land for free, and then they take that land, they sell it to northern developers. Those northern developers are going to come in and they're going to be the ones who build the towns and build the industry around all of that sort of stuff, build all of that around the railroad so that there's something for the railroad to bring people to and bring resources to and from. The total of 32 million acres is kind of hard to put together in your head. It's not an easy thing to think of and conceptualize 32 million acres. To give you an idea of what 32 million acres would be, it's the equivalent of about the state of Indiana. So that's how much land Texas was giving away just to foster this type of development. Northern moneyed interests also took over other sorts of key resources. For example, when the railroads did start getting developed in the South, there was a ton of individual railroad ownership. But by the 1890s, there was a massive consolidation in ownership. By 1890, 12 men had formed a corporation that owned one half of all the railroad track mileage in the South. And by 1895, one of those 12, one of the members of that corporation, a guy named James Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan, you see him pictured on the right of the screen, he bought out his other partners so that one man owned half of the railroad mileage across the American South. Now, the Mellon and Rockefeller families also bought things like coal mines and lead mines, salt mines. They bought aluminum resources. They bought all sorts of mineral resources across the South. And the South was becoming, in a very real way, it was becoming a colony. It was becoming a colonial economy of the North. Money was being extracted from the South and going northward. Resources were being extracted from the South and going northward. And the South was getting very little from all of that stuff. In 1907, for example, Morgan had not only bought out all of his partners in the railroad industry, but he bought up all of the coal and iron resources across the South for a cool $35 million. This would have been valued at more than $1 billion at the time. Now, this is an important industry that he's bought. If you buy up all of the coal and iron resources, you have also bought up all of the resources necessary to make steel, so you can kill any attempt at competing railroads. People need iron and steel to build railroads. They can't build it if you own all of those resources, plus you own the competing railroads. The Mellon family initially bought all of the steel producing resources across the South, valued at $1 billion. And they also ultimately wound up selling that company, which once they sold that company to J.P. Morgan, that became the modern corporation U.S. Steel. So these people are absolutely consolidating control of the resources across the South. Now, what Morgan did was something that's typical in this type of an economy. When Morgan owns all of the railroads and he owns all of the coal, and the Mellons own all of the steel production, and Morgan owns the iron, what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, we can charge pretty much whatever we want for these sorts of things. So when it comes to railroad rates, J.P. Morgan is going to institute an entirely new pricing structure across railroad traffic. Now, think about how important this would be. The United States is going to be in the business during the Civil War of trying to create a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in the 1870s, they finished that railroad. So theoretically, a cotton farmer in, say, East Texas, is going to have the ability to sell cotton to places he never could have imagined before. He's not going to be selling cotton to just people who are going to trade it through the Gulf of Mexico or trade it to people eastward or northward of Texas. That cotton farmer could theoretically sell cotton to people all the way out in Washington State or in California or in present day Oregon, something he could not have done 15, 20 years before. So theoretically, these people should have been making a ton of money. But what they're going to have to do if they want to sell that cotton, they're going to have to sell it by putting it on railroad cars and sending it to market. And what J.P. Morgan does is he said, for any railroad shipping south of Washington, D.C., people are going to pay a 35% surcharge. So they pay what a normal, average, everyday northerner would pay, plus 35%. Okay. It's discriminatory in every way. It's saying you live in the South, so you pay extra. Now, that almost sounds like a bargain compared to what he did to people in the West. He said if you live west of the Mississippi, you pay a 75% surcharge. So again, people in the North and people in the East are going to benefit from all of this stuff. Okay. The Mellon family is going to introduce a pricing scheme when it comes to steel called Pittsburgh Plus. Now, their scheme for steel production is they've bought up steel producing facilities all over the place, including places, for example, like Bessemer, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama. And what the Pittsburgh Plus pricing scheme is going to do is it's going to say there is a base price for steel, and we will sell it to people anywhere they are. We'll sell it to anyone. But the price is whatever it would cost to produce that steel plus ship it from Pittsburgh. Now, how this affects Southerners, again, in a negative way, how it affects them as opposed to somebody in the North, that Bessemer steel plant in Alabama, people in Alabama might get together and say, well, we're going to build our own railroad. We're going to compete with Morgan. We don't want to deal with his nonsense. But in order to build, we need steel. So they go to Bessemer and say, we need 5 tons of steel. They're going to get charged whatever it costs to produce that steel, plus ship it from Pittsburgh, even though it's being produced right there in Alabama. Now, you guys can all figure this out. You can figure out why they're doing this. The Mellon family is doing this to cut Southern competition out in this industry, in the railroad industry. They're partnered with Morgan. They don't want to lose that partnership. They don't want to lose their grasp, their control over all of this stuff. So they control all of this stuff, and they are able to charge pretty much whatever they want. Now, the best example of the control of the resource and dominating it and taking the wealth out of the South is the oil industry in the South. The oil boom, the first oil boom in Texas in the South began in 1901, just east of Beaumont, where a well was being drilled. Now, at the same time that this well was being drilled, there was a fair amount of oil that was being extracted in eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. And those wells, the large wells in places like western Pennsylvania, produced about 3 to 4 barrels a day. This oil well in Beaumont, outside of Beaumont, called Spindletop, this oil well produced 100,000 barrels of oil in 9 days. It was immediately the biggest producing oil well in the United States' history. By the time of its second year in operation, Spindletop had produced 17 million barrels of oil. And oil was an incredibly important commodity even back then. But even though it's being produced here, even though it's being extracted from the ground here in Texas, and there is a ton of money to be made, it is not Texans who are making the money on this Texas oil. It's Northerners who are going to be making it. The oil itself that is being extracted from the ground, it's called crude oil because it's not refined, hasn't been turned into anything useful. That crude oil was practically worthless. Okay. The money in oil is in refining it. And in order to refine the oil, you've got to get the oil to those refineries. Well, all of the refineries were actually in western Pennsylvania and in northern Ohio. And they were owned by a guy named John Rockefeller, pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm sorry, I've got the pictures kind of all wonky over the text there. I promise I will fix this when it gets uploaded into the learning management system here. Rockefeller owns all of the refineries. So he partners with J.P. Morgan, reasoning that if we're going to refine this oil, we've got to partner with the railroads to actually get that oil from Texas to Ohio. So they put together a consortium. They build it. They start building refineries. They start building what are called trunk lines to get the oil up there. And they tell these oil producers, you can drag all of the oil out of the ground that you want. We are going to set the price. And the price that Morgan and Rockefeller tell them, these oil producers, they say, we are willing to pay you 1 penny per barrel. 1 penny per barrel. So when all is said and done, when these guys have made their investments, when they've built their refineries, when they built the railroads and moved them up northward, when they start building refineries, even in places like Louisiana, realizing or rationalizing it's cheaper to transport it from, say, Texas to Louisiana than it is Texas to Ohio. Again, they're the ones who are building this and putting the money into constructing the refineries. When it's all said and done, they are making a 40 to 50% return on investment. They are the ones making money. People like Rockefeller and Morgan, not average everyday Texans. Now, these same groups of people are in control of things like salt production, aluminum production, all sorts of other industries. So the South has, in a very real way, become a quote unquote economic colony of the North. It's, economic colony is kind of redundant, but what's left for the South here is what are called quote unquote extractive industries. Extractive industries are defined as low wage and low value industries. Things like cigarette production, bourbon production. These don't cost a lot of money. They don't create or generate a lot of revenue. So they don't wind up with a lot of money being put into the hands of the people who work in those industries. The people who work in those industries don't have the ability to engage in very much consumption. So there are not things like decreasing inventories, decreasing retail inventories in the South during this era. There aren't new retail orders in the South. So wages and profits and wages stay low. There is virtually no reinvestment across the South during this era. Now, what we do see during this era, what we do actually see is that the average wealth in places like the North is exploding. The average wealth, the totality of everything that Northerners own is about $1,100. But in the South, it's only about $500. So people had to find a way to deal with all of this stuff. Now, there's also groups of people who are in a real bit of trouble besides industrial workers here. There's obviously a problem for farmers in the American South. There's a whole new economic order, if you will. And Southern farmers are going to lose out probably more than virtually anyone in this new economy post-Civil War. As these Northerners are buying up land, as they're buying up farms from these people who had been, in some cases, yeoman farmers, meaning they didn't own slaves, in the post-Civil War era, what we're seeing is that the size of Southern farms is decreasing every single year after the Civil War. When the Civil War started, the average farm size across the South was 350 acres. By 1870, the average farm size was down to 150 acres. By 1880, literally half of all of the land in the South was owned not by Northerners, but not owned by Southerners. It was actually owned by Northerners. Most Southerners were being forced into selling their land. Now, not forced at gunpoint or anything like that, but they're being forced to sell it out of economic necessity. They've got no other choice to do this. Now, what made all of this stuff even worse for Southern farmers is that they are also having to deal with a new problem. And the new problem is sharecropping and crop lien system. Now, I want to mention before we move on to this next slide here that a lot of times historians and commentators use sharecropping and crop lien interchangeably. They are not interchangeable terms. They are not the same thing. Sharecropping is the first part, and then sharecropping can develop into a crop lien circumstance, but it doesn't always develop that way. Now, the reason sharecropping winds up getting put into place, the system that gets put into place, a farmer can't just quote unquote grow things. Even if a person decided one day, hey, I think I'm going to be a farmer, you're not going to be able to just go out and grow things. Farmers need seed, they need equipment, they need food, they need clothing, they need household items, they need all of that stuff. Even an experienced farmer needs all of that stuff while their crops are in the ground and growing. Now, in order to get these things, in order to get all of that stuff, the seed, the equipment, household goods, all of that stuff, what most farmers did was they would take out a loan to get them through the growing season. Then when their crops came in, they would take the crops to marketplace, sell the goods at market, and hopefully they had enough to both pay off their debt and have a little bit of a cushion to go into the next growing season. Now, that's all well and good when you own your own land. If you own your own land, you have collateral, and it's not a problem to get those types of loans. However, when you see Southerners selling their lands, when you see more and more Southerners selling their lands, all of a sudden they have no collateral. There's nothing they can go to a financier and say, look, I'd like to take out a loan, and I can back it with nothing. There's nothing they can back it with. Now, these people don't have a lot of banks that they can go to. There's a reason I said financiers. They can't go to banks because there just are not a lot of banks in the South. There are just tons more banks in the North. Just if you look at this demographic up here on this screen, there's one bank for every 16,000 people in the North. There's one bank for every 80,000 in the South. And if you think about how the South is, the South's population is dispersed much more broadly. So it's going to be harder and harder to find banks across the South. Many counties across the South had no banks, period. So the idea of going to a bank and getting a loan was simply not an option. So what are these people going to do? How are they actually going to get money? The financiers, and especially, it's worth pointing out here, the people who were buying up all of that land came up with an ingenious idea. Their idea here is that they will loan farmers money. They'll find all of these farmers who used to own land. They'll find freedmen. They'll find all of these people who would work this land. They would lend them the money to go out and get all of the stuff they needed: the seed, the equipment, the food for their families, clothing, shelter, all of that stuff that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. They'll lend them the money to get through the growing season in exchange for a pledge or a share of the crop. Now, almost always the share was 50%. Now, I want you to understand that that share, that pledge of 50%, that comes right off the top. Okay. So if a farmer grows cotton, which they're almost exclusively going to grow cotton in the South, if they grow cotton and they come in and they harvest 10,000 bales of cotton, immediately 5,000 of it, 5,000 bales go right to the people who loaned them the money. So when they go to marketplace, they are going in with only 5,000 of the initial $10,000 or 10,000 bales. Now, when they sell those 5,000 bales, they better hope that they get enough money from those 5,000 bales to pay off the loan, because the 5,000 bales that were the quote share, those just go to that financier, period, as a sort of cost of doing business. That does not cover their loan. Okay. So they still have to pay back their loan. Now, if the farmer does not make enough money to pay back their loan, these financiers come up with another ingenious idea. They're perfectly willing to give that farmer another loan, but they're also going to tell that farmer, you are now a credit risk. You defaulted on your last loan, so you're now a credit risk, and we will give you another loan. We're going to have to raise the interest rate, and they're going to raise the rates to, typically between 30 and 70%. We'll give you another loan. It's going to be a sharecropping arrangement again. So right off the top, we get 50%, but this financing company or the agribusiness company, we're also going to place a lien on your remaining crop. So if once again, a farmer harvests 10,000 bales of cotton, 5,000 of it goes right off the bat to the financier. The remaining 5,000, whatever money they get, goes to the financier first, or the agribusiness corp first. So if they still don't make enough money to pay off the debt, that's fine. That agribusiness corp will give them yet another loan. And what you wind up seeing developing here in the South is that you see the development of quote unquote debt peonage. The debt is developing and building and building and building and building and building to a point where these farmers are never going to make enough money to get themselves out of debt. There's going to be such a constant growth in the debt that it is going to basically consume these people. Now, I have not mentioned race at all. And you should also be aware, just like when we talked about stuff with the retreat from civil rights here. Once again, there's nothing in here that says a single word about race. But I want you to keep in mind that the overwhelming majority of African Americans at this time live in the South. The overwhelming majority of African Americans are going to be involved in sharecropping. That doesn't mean that there aren't white sharecroppers. It doesn't mean that in some places there weren't more white sharecroppers than black sharecroppers. It doesn't mean that white farmers didn't get hurt in the same exact ways that black farmers get hurt. But what I am going to suggest to you is that this sort of stuff affects African American populations in disproportionate ways. Now, putting all of that aside for a second, because we're going to come back to that in a couple of lectures, let's look at what happens to Southern farmers who are growing things like cotton, for example. The mindset of farmers is going to make this stuff immeasurably worse. Farming is an independent lifestyle. It's not like Farmville where you had friends coming over and fertilizing your crops and harvesting your crops and stuff like that for you, like that little flash game did. It's an isolating and independent lifestyle. All of these farmers only know one thing. My income depends on my ability to pull crops out of the ground. The more I've got, the more I can sell, which means the more money I'm getting. All well and good until you have 10 farmers or 20 farmers or 100 farmers or 1,000 farmers doing the exact same thing. What you're seeing here is that farmers are looking at their own land and saying, my income has dropped. My only option is to grow more cotton. So they individually are going to be contributing to a problem that causes cotton prices to decline in the United States. It's simply supply and demand. There's more cotton, so the price is going down. When you have those thousands of farmers doing the same thing in the marketplace, excuse me, when you have thousands of farmers doing the exact same thing, the result is dropping prices, dropping prices, dropping prices, dropping prices. When these farmers see these dropping prices, their response is, oh crap, I got to plant more. So you see them contributing to this vicious cycle that seems to never end. They're growing more and more and more and more, but they're getting less and less and less and less. And the debt is piling up and up and up and up. Okay. These farmers are desperate. And just look at the numbers. Remember, I told you couple of slides ago, the size of the farms is declining during this era. But look at the amount of cotton that's being grown. And again, I'm not going to ask you to remember the numbers. I want you to just see it. In 1860, farmers are growing cotton on 9 million acres of land. But by 1885, while the average farm size has gone down, there's more land in production for cotton. 25 million acres of land in cotton production in 1885. And these people in 1885 are making way, way less money than farmers in 1860. So clearly, something was going to have to give. There was going to have to wind up being something that can come in and stop all of this, or at least challenge all of this. And that will be the subject for lecture 2. Thank you. And I will see you in the next class.